What is Christian nationalism? How big of a threat is it? And how might all Americans and Christians in particular respond? Well, that is the heart of the conversation we're going to have today. And I have two guests I've been looking forward to for a long time, meeting for the first time, been following their work and getting their thoughts on this because they've both written to some extent on this topic. My first guest, R.R. Reno, is the editor of First Things, and he has a book called Return of the Strong Gods: Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. Our other guest today is Dr. Paul Miller, who's the author of The Religion of American Greatness. He's a professor at Georgetown University. Fellas, thanks for taking the time to come on and discuss this topic.
Pleasure to be
Thanks for
with
having
you.
us on.
I think it'll really interest our viewers just to give a little background of where you're coming from, kind of your story and your interest and why you talk about issues of Christian nationalism or even nationalism. So, Rusty, let's start with you.
Well, I've been editing First Things magazine for a little bit more than a decade. Before that, I was a theology professor. So I really come at these political questions late in life, so to speak. And I tend to see things from a theological perspective first and foremost. But over the period of time that I was, working here at the magazine, I became more and more uh, eager to sort of understand why our political culture is in such turmoil.
Hmm.
And so one reason I wrote the book was to try to understand the crisis of politics in the West broadly. And my thesis there in the book is that we have overdone the open society consensus to the point of dissolving the shared loves that can animate a people, unify it, and inspire it.
Hmm. That's super helpful. We're going to come back and I'm going to have you unpack your thesis a little bit more. But Paul, maybe tell us a little bit of your background and your interest in why you discuss Christian nationalism and critique it so strongly.
Well, it's a different background, but it's a similar set of concerns. I spent a decade working for the government, served in the army, did some time in Afghanistan um, before coming to academia. And I approached this as a political scientist. My wheelhouse is really international affairs. But I've always been interested in questions of American identity. And as a Christian, I'm very interested in what it means to be a Christian in the public square, and how to advocate for justice, flourishing for all people. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of ordered liberty. How can we uphold a framework of ordered liberty for all of us, which I think is essentially the highest aspiration we can in the city of man, while we continue our sojourn to the city of God.
Well, before we jump into defining what we mean by Christian nationalism, maybe I could have each of you just kind of share the premise of your book because you're not asking exactly the same questions, but they intersect and will help us get to questions of Christian nationalism. So, Rusty, maybe you could start by telling us again. You have this title that's catchy, caught my attention: Return of the Strong Gods. What are you arguing for, and how does it intersect with the question of nationalism?
The strong gods are a metaphor for strong loves and strong commitments. And the thesis of the book is that after World War II, really after the catastrophe in the West of 1914, World War I, the turmoil of the interwar years, and then, of course, the tremendous destruction of the Second World War, the consensus among leaders, intellectual as well as political leaders in the United States and in the Western zone of the post-war world was that this crisis and all this destructiveness came from people believing too passionately. And so we embarked on a culture-wide project of dialing down the temperature of people's convictions and commitments. And the argument of the book is this has gone for too long and it's gone too far, and that it's reaching the point of dissolving the natural and essential commitments that unite people, bind them together, cause them to sacrifice their own self-interest, give meaning to their lives. So the return of the strong gods is a argument that populism, or whatever you want to call the political uproar of the present, is happening because our leadership class is continuing to insist upon what I call the open society consensus, while ordinary people are aware that it's gone too far and they're asking for a restoration of what I call shared loves and shared commitments. And nationalism, the nation is an obvious instance of this. I think there are three spheres of life where people feel a tremendous tug of commitment, and their family, nation, or polity, not just nation, but also could be the local community, your school, your Friday night football, and all the way up to um, honoring the flag, and then, of course, faith. So, faith, flag, and family, the three F's,
Mm.
I think, are the areas of life and all three of those areas have been undermined by the various ideologies that are very, very powerful in our time. So I think, um, I call for a restoration of all three. Um, we live in a political society where the state does not have any kind of direct responsibility for renewing faith, although it could be less hostile. The state could be less hostile to faith communities. And the family is another area where you don't want the state to be too heavy handed, although, again, we could do more to encourage family formation. Um, but the nation is the obvious area of political salience.
Hmm.
And so I think, in some ways, it's the easiest area also where people can be very passionate in their commitments without having to sacrifice very much compared to family life, as we all know. And then, of course, our faith, which really calls for us to give our all. So the book
Okay.
then, calls for this restoration of a strong sense of nationhood.
So, this post war fragmentation we see in our culture, the response is faith, flag, and family. Is it fair to say that you are pro nationalism? I know we haven't defined that yet, but on a popular sense, is that fair?
Nationalism, it can be an ideology, as in
Okay.
every time and in every place we have to, or that the nation is the most important thing. And I think a Christian can never possibly say that the nation is our most important commitment. There's another way of seeing nationalism, which is a question of priority. I think we live in a time where it's fitting to give priority to national reconsolidation. And so I would say I'm a nationalist in a way that I would have emphasized liberalism is a very important ism in a time when you're over consolidated and overly constrained and constricted culture and society. And and I think that time has passed, and we're in a period of time where we need to emphasize what I call the motifs of reconsolidation, the strong gods.
Okay. Super helpful. Let's come to you, Paul. Again, your book is The Religion of American Greatness. Tell us kind of your project of what you're doing in the book.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is there's a lot I agree with in Rusty's
Hmm.
book. I engage with it in mine, and I think that he's right that we have a kind of an instinct to seek. I think you say a transcendent ground for our political lives. That is something just built into the human person to seek that. I think the way to distinguish my argument from his is that I think the open society is certainly better than its alternative, and that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's got problems. There's things we could do better, and I do see some dangers. I see some potential dangers in an effort to reconsolidate, to thicken up our national identity. To be very clear, I don't think the nation is intrinsically a bad concept. I agree. There's an aspect of ourselves that is irreducibly social, political, and cultural. So it's good for us to participate in our national lives and to be patriots. I'm a patriot. But I want us to be very aware of the dangers, specifically of the program of nationalism. To the extent that we try to fulfill our social, political, cultural selves in something greater than ourselves, I'm far more comfortable with localism and also with the church. I think the church is the appropriate uh, political community for us to seek fulfillment in. The track record of nationalities is not great, uh, and I just want to introduce that note of caution into the conversation of reconsolidation. Let's do this. If we're going to do this at all, let's be extremely careful how we go about it, that we don't undo the gains of the open society, particularly for those who are historically on the on the receiving end of our worst oppressions. I think that would be maybe the message I'm trying to get across with my book.
There's part of me that wants to jump straight to Christian nationalism, but maybe let's talk a little bit about nationalism, because this has come up, and then downstream we'll come back to Christian nationalism. So you define it in your book, Paul. Maybe I'll start on this question with you, and then Rusty, tell us if you agree with this or not. Just give us a definition of what's meant by nationalism. I think this will ultimately bring clarity when we talk about Christian nationalism.
Yeah. So nationalism is a political ideology about how you define nations, nation states. It's the idea that cultures should have their own government. That is to say that a people defined by some shared attribute have a presumptive moral right to govern themselves with their own government, which depends upon a prior idea that that there are peoples whom you can clearly identify and demarcate from other peoples in the world. And that, I think, is actually a pretty tricky idea. Maybe we'll get into the critique here in a little bit.
Okay.
So nationalism says there are peoples, they're distinct from each other, they deserve their own government, and the government, part of its responsibility is to uphold, preserve, and protect the specific cultural identity of a people.
Okay. Rusty, would you agree with that definition? Add anything to it, qualify it in any way?
I think that's correct. The nation state, nationalism as an ism really only makes sense in a post Westphalian world. So the Peace of Westphalia, the solution to religious conflict in Europe was to sort of stabilize, if you will, the political boundaries, so that different people with different the different peoples won't beat each other's throats over the state. And I think the nation state is probably a necessary, or if not, it's probably a necessary form for democracy, because you have to have a degree of civic trust in order to accept being out of power. So peaceful transfer of power requires trust over the long term. And so I think there's an intuitive sense in which a degree of cultural homogeneity is probably necessary. That was certainly Samuel Huntington's claim. It doesn't have to be an extreme homogeneity, and I think Paul's right that we should be cautious about pressing for homogeneity that's an undue or unnecessary homogeneity. But the opposite is equally dangerous. I think if you talk to an immigrant from Lebanon, they could tell you that when a society becomes too fragmented, its political culture becomes very toxic. So we have to, in our big, giant, complex country, United States, we have to think about this, exactly to what extent are we too disunified? Are we too fragmented in 2022? Or are we too over-consolidated, too homogeneous in 2022? Do we have too much presumptive trust or too little presumptive trust? I tend to be on the side of thinking we're too fragmented, and that therefore we should emphasize these more consolidating elements. I think it's useful to talk about specifics too. I think one thing that I propose is that someone who holds two passports shouldn't be qualified for public office. Obviously, people can be citizens and have two passports, but that's a relatively recent possibility in the United States. That's only been in my lifetime that you are permitted to have dual citizenship. And I think it's a very odd that Dr. Oz could become a United States senator and also have citizenship in Turkey. I don't think it's healthy for the future of a society when plan B for a politician is to move away to another country.
That's really interesting to make the point that we're concerned about being the extremes on both sides of nationalism. And maybe this will kind of help us where the two of you differ a little bit on the level of your concern. Paul, you have some pretty strong concerns, and the way you state it, for example, you compare nationalism to Jim Crow on a global scale and say that the overwhelming record of nationalism is idolatry and oppression. Talk about why you're concerned to that level of nationalism.
So I think I can agree that we have a lot of disunity in the United States today, and I can also agree that's a we can crave greater unity. I don't think that we can reconsolidate around the old Anglo-Protestant consensus, which is what I take the Christian nationalist program to be, um, because that will simply cause further disunion, further divisiveness. And that's the theme of chapter 5 in my book. I think that nationalism boils down to another kind of identity politics. It's the identity politics of the majority tribe, right? When minority groups do it, we call it identity politics. When majorities do it, we call it nationalism. It's the effort by a majority group to make the national identity a mirror image reflection of their own identity, and say to be an American means to be one of us, and that itself can accelerate the dissolution that I think Rusty is rightly worried about. Um, so that's where all the worst dangers of nationalism can come in, that I spend several chapters warning about in the book. The record of nationalism in history is not great. Now, perhaps we're talking about different flavors of nationalism or different intensities of nationalism, but I think there's a tendency within the nationalist impulse that will always take it down this road of dissolution. So we can agree on the problem. I think nationalism is actually another version of the problem, not a great solution to it.
That's helpful. Rusty, jump in here. I suspect maybe you see it a little bit differently.
One of the underlying themes of my book, Return of the Strong Gods, is that people want, I mean, I think Pope John Paul II often emphasized people want to give themselves away in love. That's a deep human need. And so people want to participate or be part of a shared polity, a shared culture. So if we don't give them a healthy and honorable kind of national identity, then they're going to be very easily seduced by demagogues who will offer them something much more dangerous and potentially perverse. So I don't think nationalism has a bad track record. It has an uneven track record, just as all 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 there have been good empires and bad empires. There's been good democracies and bad democracies. So I don't think it. I don't think there. I don't think it's obvious to me that there's any one way to organize civic life. The Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic. The Catholic Church holds that there is no Christian polity, so there is no Christian form of government. Although Christians are called to bring their moral and wisdom and spiritual insight into the task of governance, but there is no particular Christian form of government. That's why I think the notion of Christian nationalism is a bit of a misnomer. I don't really quite understand what that's driving at. Maybe it's the Protestant world. That's not really my world, but in the Catholic world, really it would be a kind of, people would scratch their heads and say, "What, Christian nationalism? What would that be all about?"
So is your concern, just so I understand, not so much with nationalism per se, but maybe the ideas that would be driving behind nationalism, the kind of state that it is, hence it has a mixed record. Is that fair?
I think, again, I mean, you have the Woodrow Wilson notion that every ethnos deserves deserves to be self-governing. It deserves a political form in which it can nurture its shared life. And there's something obviously right about that. I mean, even the Austro-Hungarian Empire had it had really what you might call a federalist system of local self-determination on many issues, even as the empire exerted its control over the whole. Um, and this has been a modern trend. Um, this notion that an integral part of the dignity of the human person is to be self-governing, and that self-governing should have a political dimension and not just a personal dimension. And I think Rousseau certainly speaks to this pretty powerfully, um, and I think it's just part of the fabric of modernity. Uh, and so, how can we satisfy this desire in a way that leads to peace, not conflict? I think is an important question.
Paul, one concern you wrestle with in your book is how we even come up with a nation. Is it language? Is it shared interest? Is it ethnicity? I think you approach this a little bit differently. Jump in with your take on it.
Well, so Rusty, you said just a minute ago that Wilson's idea of self-determination is obviously correct. It's this may be where we differ the most. I think it's obviously not correct because it leaves open how do you define the people, and once you say peoples have the right of self-determination, you've just incentivized everyone to fight over what constitutes the self that merits that self-determination. And we've never had a situation where there's perfect self determination, certainly not across the world. What you end up having is a group of people who claim to constitute a self, claiming the mantle of a government, and then governing over all of the minorities within their jurisdiction. There's simply never a situation of perfect cultural homogeneity. And so these governments that claim to be self determining are actually practicing a form of internal imperialism, as I put it in the book. There's always the rule by a majority group over minority groups, and they tend to treat the minority groups as second class citizens at best. Of course, there's much worse ways of treating them. And so that kind of, that's the road I travel in developing my critique of nationalism. There's no real clear definition of who constitutes the self. And so the people who claim the self do it by virtue of sort of might makes right, and they exercise internal imperialism, and that raises the question of how you're going to treat everyone else in your polity. Yeah.
But that's really ultimately a rejection of democracy or a critique of democracy. So I mean, because democracy is the imposition of the will of the majority over the minority. You can have liberal constraints on the power of the majority, um, but it seems to me that you could that this is your position is ultimately a hostility towards democracy. Our founders were very ambivalent about democracy. They were worried the minority they were the most worried about are the wealthy, um, the property owners, and they were very worried that a majority would expropriate the well-to-do minority. Um, so I'm in favor of constraints on the power of the majority, but it doesn't strike me that it would be domestic imperialism for us to have majority rule. And also the difficulty of determining boundaries. I mean, this is always the case. I think in your book, you note that it's difficult to determine the boundaries of what counts as neutrality with respect to civic life. But the fact that it's difficult, it's spurious to say that because something's difficult to define, that therefore it cannot be defined or cannot be functionally defined for the purposes of civic life.
So
For instance, I think obviously an American people, uh, you know, anybody from abroad would laugh when you said you couldn't identify, the American personality. It's a huge country, 330 million people, so obviously there are many, many outliers. But a supermajority of people kind of manifest a very distinctive American personality. It's not a deep thing, Americanism, but it's awfully wide. And the children of Mexican immigrants in Texas that have the Texas flag and are going to lecture you about the right of Texas to secede from the Union while they're in their cowboy boots. It's really quite stunning how effective our our culture is in bringing people into the fold. And I take I'm very encouraged by that, actually, about for the future of our country. Part of it is, eliminating some of the unnecessary impediments to the ongoing process of assimilation, which is a kind of spurious multicultural ideology and this kind of ridiculous notion that diversity is our strength, which is, I think, obviously false, that unity is our strength.
Hmm. Paul, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I mean, all kinds of things to share there. I agree that there is such a thing as the American personality. I also affirm majority rule and democratic machinery of government. I'm not rejecting that. I'm rejecting the idea that a government can tell us who we are, that it can uphold one particular cultural template and say, this is who we are. If you don't fit, you're not truly one of us. That's, I take it to be the nationalist program. I also would, and this is maybe where we need to define what Christian nationalism is, but quite a lot of the nationalist advocates out there want to say that who we are as Americans are, we're defined by a Christian cultural heritage or the Anglo-Protestant cultural heritage. And I think that's descriptively not true today. And it is an impractical political program to try to go back to that sort of template. It's just simply not going to work. Can't put that genie back in the bottle. Um, uh, I have much more I'm happy to say, but maybe I can pause there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess uh, I mean, obviously, it's sort of false either or, that either the government does nothing to promote a cultural identity or it imposes it. Um, that strikes me as not correct. I mean, you have schools that have civics programs, and civics programs are and have always been forms of socializing children into what it means to be an American. And so obviously that's that. And I agree with Paul that I'm a American, and because I'm an American, I don't want the government to have a heavy hand. But to have a light hand is not to have no hand. Uh, and
So
also,
so
in
maybe
terms of the Anglo-Protestant and all that sort of thing, I was very impressed by David Hackett Fisher's books, Seeds of Albion, the durability of um, the settler cultures, all stemming from the British Isles in the 16th and 17th, I mean 17th and 18th centuries, um, and the ability of those cultures to endure in the various regions of our country and to again socialize, initially Eastern European immigrants who had nothing to do with the predecessor, these settler cultures. And now people from all over the world, as I said, come to Texas and settle there, and immigrants and their children and grandchildren are awful lot like the Anglo Protestants who settled
Hmm.
Texas 200 years ago, or 180 years ago, 160 years ago. It's really something. So I think it's wrong. I think the genie's out of the bottle. We're not going back to 1950, uh, but the future of our country is likely to be strongly influenced by this Anglo Protestant heritage, uh, unless we are use the power of government to impede it, and that's what I see. Um, the secular left doing is they want to use the power of government to impede the transmission of these various strands of our culture.
There, there, there's probably going to be some similar critique on the secular left, but Paul, I know you want to jump in here too.
it might be helpful if we talk some specifics.
Let's
You
do it.
raised the passport issue. I don't think I have a problem with the idea you raised. The National Conservatism Conference, on their website, they call for public honoring or public acknowledgement of the Bible's place in our lives, and I think they specifically say the institutions of our government should honor the Bible or something to that effect, which is a way of trying to reconsolidate around a Judeo-Christian identity.
Yes,
I think that's probably a bad idea because I firmly believe in the disestablishment of the church as a good Baptist. I believe in a stronger version of disestablishment. And I think that, again, doing so would be divisive, not unifying. And it would also be fairly impractical. We just can't, while I also want to see us governing justly, which I think is a biblical ideal, so I don't have any problem with that, with saying, I'm a Christian, I'm going to work for justice. But if you're saying we need more symbolic recognition of the Bible and of Judeo Christianity in American public life, I don't think that's the wisest way to try to reconsolidate our national identity.
I Yeah, I mean, I would like to see the school prayer cases from the early 1960s overturned. I think it would be a good thing for kids in North Dakota to start the school day with some anodyne ecumenical prayer acknowledging a supreme being. One of the problems we have in our society is we socialize children into a purely immanent and materialist view of the world. And it would be helpful to them and to the future of our society if they had some kind of transcendent horizon. Um, so again, we're not going to go back to the 1950s, but we live in a regime that is hostile to public expressions of religion. And I think that good governance encourages the religious life of good governance in the United States would be to encourage the religious life of the American people. It's more diverse than it was in 1950, but if we did encourage it, it would be predominantly Christian because that is the predominant, overwhelmingly predominant form of religiosity in the United States. And it strikes me as irresponsible our current approach to governance, which is refuses to acknowledge the duty of the legislator to promote religiosity. Now we have it to some extent. We have very favorable tax laws and so forth for religious institutions. This is a good thing. We do honor the Bible. The President of the United States swears on the Bible at the inauguration. Um, but it strikes me that here we have in New York, the public school system is considering getting rid of all of the holidays because we don't want to have Christmas because Christmas, is an imposition of Christianity on the population as a whole. And I mean, my observation is what you get is not religious diversity, but pure secularism. And so one of the reasons that the National Conservatism group, the big push is from my Jewish confreres. They really want Christianity to be restored to the
Hmm.
prominent role in American public life because they recognize that their children are not threatened. Their ability to transmit their faith is not threatened by Christianity. It's threatened by secularism, and that it's not Christian conversion, but it's intermarriage and ultimately the uh, giving up of religious life altogether for their children and grandchildren. That's the greatest threat to the future of Judaism.
So I love it that we found a specific issue here on school prayer that we disagree on. I actually had a whole chapter in the book that got cut out that dealt quite extensively with Engel versus Vitale, the 63 case on school prayer. I actually think that case was rightly decided. Uh, I have some theological problems with school prayer being led by public employees. It's a prerogative of the church to hold the keys of the kingdom, to exercise the teaching ministry, to lead the public worship of God. And if we outsource that to the state by allowing public school teachers to teach Bible studies or pray, the church kind of loses control over what's being taught, which might explain why Americans have always been fairly biblically illiterate. Generations of school children going to these generically monotheistic public schools and not actually learning much of biblical truth, but believing that they are learning that truth. And so they're not even aware of how little they really know of what the Bible teaches. So there's a theological problem there. And then, of course, there's a problem with allowing the state to use religion for its own purposes to create a sense of social solidarity and so forth. It really harms the church's ability to stand apart and outside of the state and offer it an independent critique. Maybe why many white churches were complicit with segregation for so long is because they had that comfortable relationship with the state for a lot of American history. So I think it's a good thing that we overturned the school prayer and Bible teaching in public schools. I think it's perfectly fine for private schools to do that, which is where my kids go, because there is a place for a private association to have a religious education But if you're going to do government schools, then I think they need to respect that separate jurisdictions of church and state.
Rusty, agree, disagree? Your thoughts?
There's a natural duty to honor our Creator. Catholic Church distinguishes between that and the supernatural faith that we have through baptism. And so when a school teacher is leading children in a, as I say, an anodyne ecumenical prayer to acknowledge the Creator, um, that school teacher is not functioning as a person proclaiming the gospel. So I don't see that as a usurpation of the church's role. It's clear that the state has an interest in the religious life of its people because religion is a great source of um, commitment and passion. I think our founders, one reason we have disestablishment is because they didn't want the religious passions to enter into civic life and cause the disruptions that it caused during the English Civil War. So I think our tradition is a very sound one, but it doesn't that tradition doesn't prohibit, as I say, a general encouragement of religiosity and piety, and the fact that it could be abused by the state to serve its own interests, I think, doesn't invalidate the duty of the legislator to encourage religiosity.
Yeah.
I think on this topic we could probably go back and forth. We have at least a little clarity on where the two of you stand, which is helpful. But Paul, can you give us a definition of Christian nationalism? And then I want to see if you agree, Rusty. And then the question I want to go to after this is whether or not what you call Anglo-Protestantism is going to be necessary for democracy. But first, give us a definition of Christian nationalism, if you will, Paul.
I think the simplest is this. If you think America is a Christian nation and the government should keep it that way, I think that's Christian nationalism in the smallest nutshell I can boil it down to. It really does depend upon that second half. The government has a responsibility and a role to take proactive measures through public policy to preserve and uphold our cultural identity as a Christian nation, whatever that means. That's kind of ambiguous itself. But if you say we're a Christian nation and the government should keep it that way, I think that's Christian nationalism.
And your take on this is our government should not favor or privilege Christianity in any fashion. Is that fair?
Certainly not as a religion, right? Because that's First Amendment. But even as a culture, in Chapter 5, I talk about a doctrine of free culture. I'm not sitting here saying that a Christian cultural heritage is bad, although people have done bad things in the name of a Christian cultural heritage in the past. That's true as well. I'm just saying that if you like a Christian cultural heritage, feel free to go out and cultivate it and advocate for it and build it in your own institutions and your, but don't look to the government to do it for you, because I think that takes the government's writ too far, and that's not what government is for. And it's uncharitable towards our neighbors who may not want to participate in that cultural heritage.
So you think you agree that the New York public schools should get rid of Christmas and Easter and Passover and all the other religious holidays?
I think probably not. I don't think I'd agree with that. For the most part, those holidays can just be passed off as seasonal holidays, or if you recognize the holidays that people are actually observing. In other words, we're not going to recognize Kwanzaa, but recognize the holidays that people are actually in your community observing. I can probably squint and find my way to that. I don't advocate for state-enforced secularism on the French model. I don't think that's a necessary implication of my argument here. I do favor a slightly more accommodationist interpretation of the First Amendment, but I want to put a pretty hard guardrail against the harder forms of establishment or state sponsorship of religion.
Yeah, I just don't see anybody in our public culture arguing for state imposition of Christianity. I mean, I'm a little baffled as to where you think the threat is here. I mean,
No, we just had a disagreement about prayer in public schools. I think that's a good example right there.
well, that's not Christianity, as we agreed. I mean, the prayer that the Vitale deemed unconstitutional was composed by Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish clergy. And it is a really anodyne acknowledgement of our Creator. I mean, two sentences, as I recall. Um, so it wouldn't be a public imposition of Christianity. It is a public encouragement of, it's a state-sponsored encouragement of religiosity. That is certainly the case.
Yeah.
I would agree with that, but not Christianity. It would only encourage Christianity de facto because if you encourage religiosity, the statistical majority of the young people are in the Christian milieu. So they'll associate that religiosity with Christianity. But I think it's within our constitutional traditions. Obviously, it was before 1962, well within our constitutional traditions to encourage, to have state-sponsored encouragement of piety, broadly understood. And I think that we've been for too long under a elite-imposed secularism, which is actually not what most Americans want, whether they're Christian or not.
Here's another example. It's the example of crosses and Ten Commandments on public lands. I used to live around the corner from the Bladensburg Cross in Maryland, just outside the D.C. area, which was a subject of a Supreme Court case just a few years ago. And it's an enormous cross commemorating World War I veterans who were killed in combat. And the Supreme Court let it stand because they said it's more of a civic symbol than a religious symbol. I think that's probably about the right ruling, and I'm not offended by it being there. But the thing is, as a Christian, I don't care. I actually don't think Christianity is strengthened or weakened whether the cross is there or not. And I don't think it's a implication of my faith to advocate for the keeping of that cross. And I don't think it meaningfully enhances the piety or religiousness of our people to have that cross in public grounds. I wouldn't advocate for proactively taking down these monuments, but as a Christian, I don't care that much about them either.
Your thoughts, Rusty?
Again, taking it down is much more symbolically significant than its erection, decades ago, because the taking of it down is saying we can't really be America unless we get rid of these public expressions of Christianity. Obviously, my magazine, First Things Magazine, was founded back in 1990 to assert both the right and the importance of religious voices in public life, speaking religiously, and not just in the anodyne civic language of our society, but to speak theologically and religiously. And I think that manifests itself in terms of these public symbols as well. They have greater or lesser significance. But you remember the big ruckus over Ten Commandments in court in front of courts and things like that back about 2 decades ago. I thought it's an innocent thing to have the Ten Commandments tablet, but this evidently was seen as a great outrage to our civic tradition, our constitutional traditions. And strike me as correct analysis. I'm not eager for there to be 10 Commandment tablets. I share, Paul, your sense there, but it strikes me as perfectly within the realm of our constitutional traditions for these plaques to be there.
I want to ask a bigger question of both of you, your concern about Christian nationalism. Let me start with you, Paul. I recently interviewed Os Guinness about his new book, 0 Hour America. And I said, you're critiquing kind of the left in this book. Why not the right? And his answer was just social location. The power is almost, whether Hollywood or the university, the media, now businesses, are almost entirely to the left. So his primary concern seemed to lie there. How concerned are you about Christian nationalism in the big scope of issues facing the church and America today?
I'm very concerned about I would call it illiberalism in all of its forms, right and left. And my next book that I plan is turning attention leftward. So I probably would find many things to agree with Oz about on that. I wrote this book about Christian nationalism because I felt the obligation to examine the plank in my eye, so to speak, before turning to the speck or the plank in the eye of the political left. Because Christian nationalism is something happening broadly on the right, and because I have grown up on the right, I still identify as right of center. I felt like it was important for me to think carefully about this thing and point out where I think it goes wrong, so that we can uh, correct our failings and go forward better and stronger and advocate for the things that we jointly believe in. If we don't call out the possible illiberalism or extremism or seeds of authoritarianism on our side, if we don't do that, we certainly can't trust the left to do that. They're not going to offer a balanced, careful, nuanced critique of these things. I think we need to do it ourselves. We have a responsibility to. If we don't, we're tacitly accepting the worst elements from our side and saying, yep, that's part of us too. So I think it's important for us to distinguish what we really truly stand for and what other people do using our name, but doing some pretty bad stuff with. Um, so there, maybe I'll leave it at that. Oz is right about the left's power in a lot of our cultural institutions. But look, the right has made some real gains legally, and of course with the Supreme Court. And it's simply false to say that the right has lost every battle for decades and decades. We've won some really important victories, particularly on religious freedom, for the last several decades. And of course, Dobbs just a couple of months ago. So the right has a lot of power politically, the left has a lot of power culturally, and they both need to be held accountable for their worst instincts.
Paul, I'm very interested when this book comes out, what the reception is when you critique the right and the left and from different people. That is a conversation I'd be fascinated to have. I think that would be very revealing in many
I will
ways.
have no friends left.
Either everybody will love you or nobody will love you, or somewhere in between. I appreciate that you do that and that you take a look within and say, where do we as a church need to fix things first? I think that's commendable and helpful. In the big picture of things, Rusty, your concern about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I guess I don't have any exposure to Christian nationalism. I really don't. We don't. I run a magazine, um, just published something by a Muslim author. We have a Jewish columnist. So it'd be kind of odd to think that we're a Christian nationalist magazine. As I just published a piece on defense of American empire. So maybe we're not even a nationalist magazine. But you get demotic preachers, megachurch preachers, and so forth that will say things about Donald Trump. I find myself often rolling my eyes and thinking, well, that's a kind of crude biblical application of the Bible. But I don't see it as a program or a plan for governance. In fact, I would say that the Christian right's biggest problem is that it has no governing agenda. It wants just good Christians to be in positions of public office and power, and it doesn't really have. I was at this NatCon meeting, and there was a Protestant panel, and I came away. They were kind of lashing themselves for not having a stronger vision for governance, and I left the panel thinking, American evangelicalism is set up to convert the nation, not to actually govern it. So I don't lose any sleep over these kind of the governing implications of Trump as the next King David or something like that. Instead, I just see this as what you do in a biblical tradition when you're trying to convey, you're throwing your prudential judgments into the form of a kind of essential biblical truth, which I think is a mistake to do that. The Bible doesn't map on to contemporary American politics so neatly and so conveniently. But Paul, I'm just kind of curious. So what's being proposed out there that would count as Christian nationalism?
It's funny. I was actually going to ask.
There's no one suggesting a citizenship test or a test for public office because, as you say, some of the most ardent folk that talk this way are in your Baptist tradition or in affiliated traditions that are extremely strong on separation.
I had written down in my notes to ask you a similar question, which is more or less, what do you think is the real practical agenda of the post-liberal right? And I say post-liberal right to embrace a broader, nationalists, integralists, Christian nationalists, the sort of the right that has rejected conventional conservatism or seeks to go beyond it. Because I also am scratching my head trying to find out what their specific agenda is. There's a few items out there. I do think the school prayer thing is an example of it that I think is specific and also wrong. But immigration restrictionism seems to be a big part of this movement on the right,
Yeah, I think
and there's some and there's some economic components to it as well. They don't like free trade very much, but I really wonder why there's so much energy and passion and even hostility towards conventional conservatism when I can't find the policy specifics that depart from conventional conservatism all that much. So I turn the question around. What do you think? Where is the agenda, and is there a future here to the post-liberal right?
no. I think there is an agenda. I think that how do we want to put this? The agenda in foreign policy is I think, how would I describe this in one sentence? We need to do a full inventory of our global commitments, carefully assessing their contribution to our national interest. It's time to do some stock taking about our global commitments and carefully scrutinize them according to the principle of national interest. I think in economics, uh, there is a consensus that we need to alter the rules of the road for our free economy to give greater advantages to high school educated Americans in the job market. Or to put it even more simply, the rate of return on capital needs to fall and the rate of return on labor needs to rise. And that's something that can be done by not by socialism, but by changing the rules of the road, tax policy, trade policy, intellectual property law, all these kinds of complex things, banking law, finance law, and that all changes incentives and will shift where the rewards flow in our economy. And then in the cultural realm, which I think you and I are interested in, maybe the most, um, I think there's a the agenda is to um, downscale the legal regime that uh, that that provides the tools for the cultural left to impose its views on the entire population. So we're going to publish something soon calling for the repeal of Title IX,
Hmm.
and we published a piece a few months ago on defeating the equity regime and what Supreme Court cases need to be overturned in order to blunt the power of civil rights law um, to compel conformity to the current woke agenda in the corporate world. Um, so I think there are things there, and then obviously immigration is a kind of economic and cultural nexus, which is why it's so um, why I think it looms so large in the voters' minds because they see both sides of it. It's job competition, but it's also a question of what kind of it's a fundamental question. Who do you bring into your national community? That's a fundamental question that Huntington in his last book, it all turns on the question, who are we? And we need to have a national conversation. Who are we? Who do we want to become as a people?
Hmm.
Um, I, for instance, would say we'd be a better, stronger country if more people went to church. I don't, again, I'm with you. The idea that the government is going to compel people to go to church is just insane, theologically and politically. Uh, um, but I see a lot of people who are talking about we're a Christian nation, we need to stay a Christian nation. What they're really saying is something very simple, which is that they're wishing, they're hoping, they're praying for a future for the country that where more people go to church. And I don't think you and I would disagree that that would be a good thing. It's about the
Yeah,
means, but nobody's proposing means. It seems to me nobody's proposing means that involve using the government.
well, okay. So you just laid out a couple of ideas, some specifics, and thank you for that. And I look forward to seeing some of those articles. Um, yeah, my knee jerk reaction when you talk about repealing Title IX from my kind of classically liberal or old style conservative stance is to say, is the problem Title IX or is the problem the abuse of Title IX? Do we need to repeal Title IX or simply get it reinterpreted the correct way? And I'm dispositionally inclined, not being an expert on this issue, to say the problem is probably the abuse, not the principle itself, not the law itself. And so I guess I'm in favor of more incrementalism than these kind of more radical solutions like repealing it altogether. Um, as for whether or not people are actually advocating the use of the government, you know, famously, Sohrab Ahmari's piece some years ago saying that we need to take back the public square and reorient it towards the common good and vanquish the other side, so to speak. I mean, that's not quite an exact quote, but it sure sounded as if he was advocating for using the government to privilege, Judeo-Christian morality in some sense. And so, with that sort of rhetoric, it sounds as if some people are looking for the government to get involved here.
Yeah, I mean, Judeo-Christian morality. I mean, there you have natural law thinking. I know you've written about the drag queen story hour business. Uh, I find myself thinking that it's school boards. I mean, libraries are educational institutions, and it's just harmful to children. And so if I mean, if I was on the school board, I mean, the library board, I would be strongly arguing against allowing drag queen story hour. If someone said neutrality, we don't have to be neutral with respect to things that are harmful. Um, and maybe somebody thinks on the school board thinks that drag queen story hour is not harmful to children. In fact, it broadens their horizons. Well, we can have a debate about that, it seems to me. And if I lose the vote, I got to go in the local community and make my argument to get new new library board members. Um, yeah, I don't. I see Amari as wanting the Judeo-Christian morality to have greater influence on the ordinary machinery of civic life, of government life, not tearing down the First Amendment. Although sometimes he can sound that way. Fair enough.
And to be clear, I would join you in opposing any mandatory drag queen story hour for school children. The case at hand was about a voluntary event that people could choose to go to or not to go to, and I don't think there's grounds to say they're not allowed to invite people to such an event. But yeah, it's a good example.
Yeah, I would go further. As a library board member, I would say no. We're not going to have the neo-Nazis meeting, even on a voluntary basis, and we're not having the drag queen story hour. And I think this speaks to our disagreement about what the biggest problems facing our society are. I mean, I think as if I was a library board member, I would be thinking we need to reconsolidate what I call make normal normal again. We need to help our society reconsolidate around a capacious but sane vision of what it means to be a healthy, happy, thriving citizen. And because we know that it's not happening now, I mean, we've got declining life expectancy in our country, which is shocking. You got 100,000 people a year dying of drug overdose death. You've got a collapse of marriage among high school educated Americans. So I look at that as misleadership from the top. And the misleadership is by privileging or thinking that the greatest problem that we face is a kind of overly oppressive, overly homogeneous culture that we need to use our liberal traditions to create space and breathing room within. I think that's so my childhood. And instead we live in a time when everything is falling apart and fundamental institutions are collapsing. And I think good leadership within the constraints of our constitutional tradition, which I think is very valuable, it needs to press in the direction of reconsolidation. Helping young people learn what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, and how men and women should come together in respecting each other in a way that's fruitful, and et cetera, that would renew marriage and fertility, both of which are in the toilet right now.
Yeah. And I think we share a lot of those.
I'm not sure we
goals.
disagree, because I don't think we disagree about our constitutional tradition, which has a powerful and I think significant liberal element to it. So I cherish it. I'm very grateful to live here and not in Europe, which has far less protection of individual liberty. And like free speech, we are so blessed to have such a strong free speech legal constitutional tradition in our society. But within those constraints, I think I'm inclined to want to push toward stronger shared normative community, um, which I think we can do without violating either the spirit or the letter of our constitutional traditions.
Paul, I think you want to jump in here, and then I've got a final question for each of you.
Is there a danger of a cancel culture from the right if we try that reconsolidation? You said don't want to let the neo Nazis use a library, don't want to let the drag queens use a library. At what point does this become a version of cancel culture where we decide the boundaries of acceptable cultural expression and use the power that we have culturally or politically to kind of police that? If we don't like
Of
cancel
course,
culture from the left, should we not would not practice it ourselves?
of course, there's a danger of abuse. There's no course of action that doesn't have these kinds of dangers. But I think governance is always a question of what is the greatest problem, because once you identify the problem, you're willing to tolerate risks in order to pursue some kind of solution to the problem. So if the problem is dissolution and deconsolidation, and then you need to reconsolidate that, I'm willing to tolerate the risks of these kinds of abuses, which are quite real, and I agree with you. And I would hopefully, in pursuit of reconsolidation, will be vigilant in preventing these kinds of excesses, or at least minimizing them. But I don't think you can pursue the goal of reconsolidation without risking a certain kind of majoritarian oppression. Um, and again, we are very blessed to have a constitutional tradition that gives us powerful resources to resist that tendency. But it's going to be a risk there. Um,
The question you keep returning to, which is the greatest danger, I think probably has different answers in different parts of the country. And I think that I would be more inclined to agree with you as a description of the deep blue parts of the country. But I'm not convinced that's actually the biggest problem elsewhere in the country, which is why local and federal solutions strike me as the wisest approach.
I agree. I'm a firm. That's why I said I'd like Vitali overturned. You might get school prayer in North Dakota. You're not going to get school prayer in New York State. I'm happy to live with that. And in fact, I think one people have talked about, civil war and so forth. One way to take the temperature down in some of our cultural conflict is to defederalize uh, some of it. And I think overturning the school prayer cases would be defederalizing policy with respect to education and religion.
Yeah.
This has been a super helpful conversation. I think we found some common ground, found some difference. I'm going to ask you if you just kind of give some final thoughts. And I guess my big question is, in this cultural moment that we're in, how do we best love our country and be faithful to the Lord? How do we best love our country and be faithful to the Lord? Rusty, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think it's always important to recognize that our country is a great country, well worthy of our patriotic loyalty, but it is a project in this world, and it is doomed, as all things of this world are, ultimately to um, stumbling and doing grievous things that we ought to criticize. But also, it can't be our ultimate loyalty. And I think this is one thing that religious people can contribute to our civic culture, because we're in a time period when we're way over prioritizing politics. And I think religious folks can provide that transcendent horizon that lets people recognize that politics is important, but it's not the most important.
Well said. Paul.
I think first I just want to say, Rusty, this was the first chance you and I have had to really interact, and I enjoyed it so much. I really appreciate the conversation. It's been a lot of fun. Lots of agreement, a few disagreements here, but thank you for being a model of civic disagreement. And maybe this is a good answer to your question, Sean. How can we love our country, love our neighbor? Is learn the art of loving civic disagreement. We're going to have different views of what our country is. You should love your country by getting to know your country, which also means getting to know your neighbor. And when you find that your neighbor sees things differently than you do, that's okay. And don't immediately come to the conclusion that we're on the verge of civil war. It is a great country. I think it's an exceptional country. I love what America stands for. And I think that so much of our history is a good story of living up more and more to our ideals. And that's a wonderful blessing from the Lord. And I think we can be faithful to the Lord, as Rusty reminded us, by keeping distinct our loyalties here in this world and this great country, keeping that distinct from our ultimate loyalties, which should lead us higher. So thank you for the conversation, Sean.
Another great response. Appreciate both of you, and I want to commend each of your books. We'll start with Rusty's book, R.R. Reno, Return of the Strong Gods. Return of the Strong Gods, fascinating read. And then the most recent, I would consider kind of the primary critique of Christian nationalism, is The Religion of American Greatness by Paul Miller. Both well worth the read and the interaction. Really appreciate you guys, but before I let you go, just want to invite our listeners. This is brought to you by Biola University, and these are the kinds of conversations we try to foster within the faith, outside the faith, and our main goal here is clarity. So if you thought about getting an apologetics degree, we have a fully online degree, and we talk about these kind of concerns for America, the church, and beyond. We would love to have you join us. And don't forget to hit subscribe. Fellows, I could not have enjoyed this more, even though it was 6:30 a.m. in the morning for me when we recorded this. It was the only time we could do it, and I was so looking forward to talking with both of you, and certainly did not disappoint. Thanks so much for coming on, for great work, and just the charity and clarity in which you carried out this conversation.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.